Let's take a look at what you're doing this week. We are in Module 3, and we are focusing on husbandry and training. You have your brief overview and your objectives, along with your list of activities. This week you will have 3 assignments, 2 discussions, and then 1 assignment enrichment report. You have your learning materials here, which includes 2 short videos, learning resources, other articles that you need to read, and a required video here on welfare in dairy cows. Your first discussion takes a look at some controversial methods in animal husbandry. So some methods are believed to be beneficial by some people, but then other people think that these are not beneficial methods. You want to choose a controversial method of husbandry. You want to look up arguments for both sides of this controversy. What is the evidence that says that this is a good husbandry tactic? And then the people that say that it's not a good tactic, what are they saying? And you want to make sure that you support your claims. And when we talk about supporting claims in science, we don't just mean a general statement. We typically mean there has been a study and there is data available showing that this is beneficial or this is harmful. You want to think of scientific evidence, not just general statements. You will post that, and then your response, find 2 of your peers, look at what they have posted. Do you think that this is a controversial method? Do you think that there's an alternative method that could be used? Are there certain pros or cons about that method that your peer did not mention? Your second discussion is looking at animal learning. Based on the letter of your last name, pick either habituation or sensitization if your last name begins with A through M. If your last name begins with N through Z, then you are going to focus on classical conditioning. This is an associative form of learning. Habituation, sensitization is non-associative form of learning. We're not looking at operant conditioning this week. That's something that's going to go to next week. So don't use operant conditioning. If you're doing conditioning here, it's just classical conditioning, not operant conditioning. If those terms are unclear, go back and take a look at the lecture videos. Now it's asking you to find scholarly sources. If you're not sure about what constitutes a scholarly source, you can use this link. Typically with a scholarly source, we want it to be peer reviewed. That means that it has been published in a scientific journal that has gone under review by other scientists in that field. They give you a few sources down here. These would typically all be open access peer-reviewed journals. You can also search in some of these. If you're seeing a journal name with volume and pages, you're looking at a peer-reviewed journal. If you're looking at a blog, a YouTube video, a website, those are not peer-reviewed. This link will tell you a little bit about how to decide if something is peer-reviewed. So you're going to find a journal article on your topic. In your discussion post, you're going to answer these questions. So what type of learning did you look at? So was it habituation, sensitization, or classical conditioning? What type of paper did you look at? Was it a lit review or was it a research study? Both of those types of studies can be peer reviewed. The difference is a research study is providing new data that has not been published before, whereas a lit review is going back and looking at previously published papers and kind of putting them all together in one spot. One way to pretty easily tell whether you're looking at a research study or a lit review is to look for methods, because a research study will have methods, it'll have a results section, and it will have new data being presented. Whereas a lit review typically won't have a method section and won't have a results section. Now, it doesn't mean that they won't sometimes have graphs, because they might bring in data from these previous studies. So they might have something that looks like data, but again, this is not new data that's being presented in a lit review. Look at what are some of the main findings of your paper based on the type of learning that you're focused on, and describe in, say, 3 to 6 sentences what that paper is telling us. You don't want to go over the methods. What is our take-home message from this particular paper? And then you also want to make sure that you give the paper reference in a proper APA 7 format. Make sure that you give the full author's names, date, the article title, the journal title, and the volume and pages. One of the best ways to find that is to see if the article you have comes in a PDF format, because typically when you you download that PDF format, you're going to find that information somewhere on that article. After you post this, then your response, which is going to be due 3 a.m. Monday, is to find a peer that talked about the other type of learning. So if you had habituation sensitization, then you're going to look for one on classical conditioning. So you want something other than what you did. State a concept that you learned from your peer's post. Reiterate what you learned from them, and then how you might apply that when you're working with animals. Down here, there's also information on how to use Unity's library to do a search of the databases. Next, you have your week 3 assignment enrichment report. Here, you are a caretaker responsible for taking care of a particular captive animal, and your boss has asked you to write a report that details how you're using enrichment items for your animal. In this report, you're going to have an introduction, methods, results, discussion, and references. This is what you would find in a typical scientific paper where they have conducted an experiment. In your introduction, you want to pick one of your species that you're going to do this enrichment report for. You want to list its scientific name. In your introduction, you typically want to give some sort of a context about this animal and this study that you're doing. So you might describe a little bit about the natural habitat of the animal, and what you're really trying to do there is to tie in this enrichment. So if an organism normally has a particular behavior that they do in the wild, and in normal captive environments they're not able to express that wild behavior, then you want to talk a little bit about that and how this enrichment is going to allow them to express that natural behavior. You want to make sure that what you're putting in this introduction gives your reader a context. This is the animal I'm looking at. This is why we're going to do this type of enrichment for this animal. Then in your next section, you're going to write your methods. So how are you going to do this enrichment? You're going to look at 2 different enrichment options. And you're going to label those 2 options as option 1 and 2. What kinds of things might you give to this animal to play with, to feed on, whatever? For each of those enrichment options, you're going to describe a particular behavior that you're going to be looking at, that you're interested in. So it might be engaging with the object, approaching the object. What are you going to look for in your animal after you give it this enrichment? And these would be obviously behaviors that you're interested in seeing more of or less of. If you've got an animal that's doing some sort of negative behaviors or pacing or chewing on things that it shouldn't be chewing on, then maybe what you're trying to do is to get them to reduce that behavior. So you might be trying to increase a particular type of behavior that is normally found in the wild, or you might be trying to reduce a type of behavior that is typically a stereotypical behavior of animals that are bored and frustrated. So you're going to list the 2 different behaviors. In the third, you're going to produce your results. You're going to set out each enrichment item. You're going to observe the animal if it engages in this particular behavior that you're interested in. You're given the data here. They don't want you to change the data. These are your data. You're not actually carrying out the study. You're just pretending like you've carried the study out. You've defined what enrichment option 1 is and option 2. You've also described what behavior 1 and behavior 2 is. And what we're looking at here is within a 24-hour period, how many times did you see them doing that behavior? So if they did behavior 1 in this time slot, there's a 1 there. If they did not, there's a 0 there. You placed out a ball for them to play with. In 1, they interacted with the ball here. They did not interact with the ball down here. These are all your data for that period. Now what you want to do is to take that information and you want to create a graph of that information. First, before you can do that, you're going to look at the frequency of the behavior and the percentage of the amount of time that the organism engaged in that particular behavior. If all of this represents 100% and half the time we see 1s, half the time we see 0s, then they perform this behavior 50% of the time. You're going to look at the frequency and percent. Frequency is just the percent in its decimal form. So if a frequency is 0.50, the percent is 50%. Then you're going to create a graph. So in your results section, you want to create a graph where you're showing your reader, in this case your boss, how the organism compared in these two different enrichment options. It's asking you to do a bar graph where you're displaying the percent session interaction for enrichment option 1 and then also for enrichment option 2. When you create a graph, on your y-axis is your dependent variable. This is the one that you're really interested in. So this is going to be the frequency or the percentage of time they did a particular behavior on your y-axis. Your x-axis is really what you are manipulating. So what are you manipulating? Well, you're manipulating the type of enrichment, right? So you have control over what enrichment you give them. What you don't have control over is how they respond to it. You want the enrichment type to be on your x-axis, and then how they responded to it, that percent interaction, is going to be on your y-axis. There's some instructions here for setting up a bar graph in Excel. I will show you how to do that. I will do it using some different numbers so that then you can practice using the numbers here. After you create your graph, you want to make sure that you also label your axes. So I'll go over that in the Excel that I show you as well. After you do your graph, the next section of your paper will be the discussion. In your discussion is where you make sense of the data that you've just provided. What does it mean? If I look at your graph and I see that there's 25% interaction with behavior enrichment 1 and 80% interaction with behavior enrichment 2, and these are behaviors I want my animal to do, then what does that mean? Well, that would mean that I want to give them more of enrichment 2 because they really engaged with that. They were doing the type of behavior I want to see them doing. How do you make sense of the data? That's what you're really doing in the discussion. And typically you also want to tie that back to your intro. Remember, your intro gave them some context. So now that you've got results, how do the results that you've generated tie back to the context of your original idea in the introduction? So you want to tie that back in there. And then you have a reference section. You want to have at least 3 relevant references in APA 7 format. You want something that is very specifically geared towards this study that you just did. When you put them in the reference section, you also want to make sure that they are cited somewhere in the text. When we see things cited in scientific writing, it's always also cited within the text. It's not a bibliography, it is a literature cited. And so that means that we have cited it somewhere parenthetically at the end of a sentence where we've used that material. So I'm telling you where I got that information so that you as the reader can track it down. And then you have your grading rubric here. So you can also make sure that you go back and look at the list here, the points they're worth, to make sure that everything is included. So I'm going to create a separate video where I show you how to do the Excel. That way, if you have to go back and look at it, you're not having to go back through this whole video again. So look for my second video for the week on how to create your graph in Excel. I hope you have a great week.